looks like I'm having problems with my microphone here. But anyway, as I was saying, that notice at the end of our civilization, we are arriving at a cosmology of a gigantic sphere. Once again, just as at the end of the Greek civilization, by the time you get to Ptolemy, they have the finished image of the cosmos as being encased inside a series of celestial spheres. In our case, we too have arrived at the end of our cosmology to the image of a gigantic sphere. So once again, we find ourselves encased and protected and immunized in a gigantic sphere. It's just a much bigger one this time. What's beyond and outside that sphere is the mystery. What is this cosmos expanding into? What's beyond it? It's not something we're ever going to know. But it's a great mystery, and that's the final cosmological vision that is coming about in our civilization. And it is part of the integral development, the aperspectival integral development, because for Gebser the primary image now shifts to a sphere. In the magical it had been a point, in the mythical it had been a two-dimensional polaristic circle, in the mental the triangle with the vertex pointing at the vanishing point, and now we have the sphere, which is integral and systatically begins to put back together all the varying perspectival slices that had been carved up by the mental consciousness structure, and is putting them together to create a complete and holistic sphere. Now this leads me to think about, anyway, the issue of dimensions and dimensionality. As he had said, the world of the mythical consciousness structure is two-dimensional, and I think he's got this right. It is a two-dimensional world. It's not a higher dimensional or n-dimensional world that's larger and higher and more complex than the three-dimensional world. It's two-dimensional because in the mythic landscape, everything is based on repetition. Archetype, cliche, stereotype, repetition, Plato's denial of time. Time is the moving image of eternity, which is another way of saying that being is that which always is and never was. This is the realm, of course, of mythical archetypes, which every time a ritual is performed, what you're really doing is stopping time, arresting it, and reenacting the primordial event, making it present in the present moment, and you're flattening space and time out into an iconic image, basically. And so mythic icons and hieroglyphic thinking are basically compressions, flattenings and compressions of complicated, complex processes that unfold over long periods of time. And so the mythical consciousness structure is two-dimensional, whereas with the infinite spatial world that Spengler had talked about as characteristic of Faustian civilization, and which Gebser says here is the perspectival or late rationalistic phase of the mental consciousness structure, is three-dimensional. And then along comes the four-dimensional structure of the integral consciousness structure, which now integrates time as the fourth dimension. Time is it's moving, it's in motion, and so this hypersphere that Gebser is talking about is a sphere that's in motion. Time is the moving aspect, so it's processual. It's a sort of processual hypersphere. But now, while this may be characteristic of the epoch that Gebser is talking about here, which begins, let's say, in the middle of the 19th century and extends up to about the time that he's writing, which is to say World War II or just after, I think we can say that it's only during that epoch that the integral aperspectival consciousness structure applies. After that, after World War II, it begins to splinter and fall apart. So I think that at just the time that Gebser is writing this book in 1949, the world that he is talking about and celebrating, namely the world of modernism, is already passing, vanishing, and disintegrating at the very moment that he's talking about it. This happened to me too, by the way, when I wrote my book in 2005 about cinema, when I celebrated the great, and I said in that book that cinema was at its apogee. It had attained its greatness as an art form starting in 1968, all through the 70s and 80s and 90s. But no sooner did I finish that book and publish it than I subsequently began to realize, as more and more films came out through the decade of the aughts, the 2000s, that cinema had already passed its noon point and was actually already long since, at least since the early 90s, in the process of disintegration at the very moment that I was celebrating its triumph as the great art form. And so that often happens. A thinker will celebrate a development that is already passing the very moment that he's celebrating it, because waking consciousness, of course, is always directed to the past, and it's always just catching up to the present and the developments in the arts and sciences that are happening. Usually he's late on the scene. And I think here what happened then After World War II, as we began to revert back to a two-dimensional society, I think Gebser's sort of n-dimensional cosmos that was worked out through all of modernist art and is still being worked out in certain respects by certain contemporary artists who are concerned with creating n-dimensional objects that are complex and multifaceted. But what happened was, after the American victory in World War II, the two-dimensional cosmos came back in, and we got, with the rise of electrotopia, the creation of the celebrity during this period. The celebrity is a mythical two-dimensional construct, an individual, a three-dimensional, real, actual individual who generates, via electric technology, a flat two-dimensional icon of him or herself that then begins to take on life in this kind of electrotopic world that we've created and set in motion. It was at the tail end of World War II that electronic technologies began to come into being, and they built and created this two-dimensional, light-speed, electrotopic world that we've been living in ever since, and which has now slowly begun to hijack our society. Everywhere you look, we see flat, two-dimensional images, advertising, billboards, the electronic billboards that decorate the buildings of Shanghai. Our billboards more and more are becoming electronic on all of our streets as we drive past them. Self-luminous screens at our gas stations and on the seat in the airplane in front of you. Everywhere we look, we've got these self-luminous screens with their two-dimensional light-through technologies, these subtle technologies that are reconfiguring and retrieving the mythical two-dimensional world of image floods. And I think that's what's happened. It's also happened on the physical plane with the triumph of the American consumer society, the planetization, the American suburbanization of the planet, the transformation of the world into a gigantic shopping mall. Shopping malls and airports and hotels are basically what Marc Augé called non-places. That is to say, they're culturally non-specific, they're worldless, and they're denuded of any kind of culturally specific references in there. Therefore, two-dimensional. Only authentic cultural landmarks and cultural buildings like a cathedral or a palace or a Bauhaus building or what have you is culturally specific and therefore three-dimensional. It's a realization and building in Heidegger's sense of a world of authenticity and value and meaning and purpose. Whereas the consumer shopping electrotopia that with the Americanization of the planet has been spread and exported all over the world, a McDonald's is a McDonald's wherever you put it, whether it's in Shanghai, China, or in New Jersey. It's still a McDonald's, and it's flat, two-dimensional, because it's simply a repetition of an image, an icon. All of these shopping stores and shopping malls, and our cookie-cutter suburbs, which are based on these little two-dimensional repetitions of these houses that are exactly the same as in the opening montage of Showtime's television show Weeds, which captures it perfectly. This is the triumph of a flat, two-dimensional, depthless world. There is no depth to this world, and as a result, it's suffering from a semiotic vacancy, a lack of meaning. Nihilism has prevailed. This two-dimensional world, unlike the mythical world, which wasn't nihilistic, though it was also two-dimensional, they share this two-dimensionality in common, but not the nihilism.